The warning signs had been there for months, scattered across the outer rim of human space like breadcrumbs leading to an inevitable confrontation. Captain Henry Brooks stood on the observation deck of Outpost Meridian, watching the distant stars through reinforced glass that had witnessed humanity's expansion into the cosmos. At 42, he had spent the better part of 2 decades in military service, climbing through the ranks with a combination of tactical brilliance and an uncommon ability to read situations that others missed. His dark hair had started graying at the temples, a physical reminder of the weight he carried as commander of Earth's most remote military installation. Meridian sat at the edge of the outer colonies, a defensive position strategically placed to monitor the border between human territory and the unknown reaches beyond. The station housed 215 personnel, a mix of military operators, civilian scientists, and support staff who had volunteered for what many considered a suicide posting. The outpost itself was a marvel of engineering, a rotating wheel design that generated artificial gravity through centripetal force, its hull reinforced with composite armor capable of withstanding impacts from micrometeorites and small arms fire. But everyone stationed there knew that if a real threat emerged, their defensive capabilities would be limited to buying time for a distress signal to reach Earth. Lieutenant Katie Morrison entered the observation deck, her footsteps barely audible against the soft hum of the station's life support systems. At 28, she was young for her position as Chief Intelligence Officer, but her analytical mind and pattern recognition abilities had earned her the posting despite some resistance from the old guard. She carried a data tablet, her expression troubled in a way that made Brooks turn from the window even before she spoke. "The reports we have been tracking just escalated," she said without preamble. Morrison had never been one for unnecessary formality when serious matters demanded attention. "The Kreth fleet movements we detected 3 weeks ago have consolidated. Long-range sensors are picking up massive energy signatures near their staging point, and the fleet composition suggests this is not a standard patrol or exploration group." Brooks took the tablet, his eyes scanning the data with practiced efficiency. The Kreth Collective had been a known entity for approximately 8 months, first contact established when one of their scouting vessels encountered a human exploration ship in a neutral zone between territories. The initial exchange had been cautious but not hostile, a mutual recognition that 2 spacefaring civilizations had finally met in the vast emptiness of space. Diplomatic channels had opened, tentative at first, with both sides sharing limited information about their respective governments and capabilities. What humanity had learned about the Kreth was simultaneously fascinating and concerning. They were a militaristic society organized around conquest and territorial expansion, having subjugated or destroyed 17 other species in their documented history. Their technology was advanced, particularly in the fields of energy weapons and faster-than-light travel, and their fleet numbered in the thousands of warships ranging from small destroyers to massive dreadnoughts that dwarfed anything in the human arsenal. The Kreth were taller than humans on average, with exoskeletons that gave them natural armor, and they regarded other species with a mixture of curiosity and contempt that reminded human historians of various empires throughout Earth's bloody past. The official diplomatic position from Earth had been one of cautious engagement. Humanity was still relatively new to interstellar politics, having only achieved practical FTL capability 15 years earlier. The United Earth government had advocated for peaceful coexistence, offering trade agreements and cultural exchanges while quietly accelerating military development programs that had languished during the decades of colonial expansion. But there were those in the Kreth leadership who viewed humanity's rapid technological development and independent spirit as a threat to their established order in this sector of space. "How many ships?" Brooks asked, his voice steady despite the implications he was already calculating. Morrison pulled up a detailed sensor analysis, her fingers moving across the tablet with practiced precision. The display showed a 3-dimensional representation of space near the border, with dozens of red icons clustered in a formation that suggested coordination and intent. "We are tracking 47 vessels," she replied. "The composition includes 12 heavy cruisers, 24 destroyers, and 11 support ships. The energy readings suggest they are preparing weapons systems and running pre-combat diagnostics. Based on their current vector and speed, they could reach our position in approximately 72 hours if they maintain their current trajectory." Brooks felt a cold certainty settle in his chest. This was not a patrol or a show of force meant to intimidate. This was a strike fleet, assembled with a specific purpose and target in mind. The question was whether Meridian was the objective or simply an obstacle to be removed on their way to something else. Either way, the Outpost would be in the crossfire, and his responsibility was to protect his people and buy enough time for Earth to respond. "Sound General Quarters," he ordered. "Get everyone to their stations and initiate defensive protocols. I want a priority transmission to Earth Command with all sensor data attached. Make sure they understand this is not a drill or a false alarm. We are looking at a probable hostile engagement within 3 days." Morrison nodded and moved to the communications panel built into the bulkhead. Within seconds, alert klaxons began sounding throughout the station, a distinctive two-tone pattern that every crew member had trained to recognize. Brooks watched as the lights in the observation deck shifted from standard white to the amber of elevated alert status, a visual reminder that everything had just changed. The next 72 hours passed in a blur of preparation and mounting tension. The crew of Meridian moved through their duties with grim determination, checking and rechecking systems that might mean the difference between survival and annihilation. Dr. Lisa Grant, the station's chief medical officer, converted 2 cargo bays into emergency triage centers, stockpiling medical supplies and preparing for casualty scenarios that kept her awake at night. Commander Paul Carter, in charge of defensive systems, ran continuous drills with his weapons teams, knowing that their small arsenal of point defense cannons and missile batteries would be vastly outgunned if combat began. Brooks had sent multiple transmissions to Earth, each one providing updates on the approaching fleet and requesting guidance from command. The response had been frustratingly limited due to the vast distances involved. Even with quantum entanglement communication systems that bypass traditional light speed limitations, the sheer bureaucracy of the United Earth government meant that decisions took time. The initial acknowledgement had come within hours, confirming receipt of the intelligence and stating that the situation was being evaluated at the highest levels. But no orders had followed, no fleet dispatched to reinforce their position or evacuate the outpost before the Kreth arrived. As the deadline approached, Brooks called a meeting of his senior staff in the command center, a circular room at the hub of the rotating station, where holographic displays showed real-time data from every sensor and system. Morrison, Carter, Grant, and Chief Engineer Daniel Cole gathered around the central table, their faces illuminated by the blue glow of tactical projections. "The Kreth fleet will be within weapons range in approximately 6 hours, Morrison began, updating the timeline with new sensor data. "They have maintained their formation and course with no deviation. All attempts at communication have been ignored. We have to assume hostile intent at this point." Carter leaned forward, his weathered face set in hard lines. "Our defensive capabilities are limited against a force this size. We can engage maybe 3 or 4 ships simultaneously before our systems overheat, and that is assuming perfect accuracy and no incoming fire. If they coordinate their attack, we will be overwhelmed within minutes." Dr. Grant spoke up, her voice quiet but steady. "I have prepared for mass casualties, but our medical facilities were never designed for combat scenarios of this scale. If they breach the hull or we lose environmental controls, we will lose people faster than I can save them." Cole, a heavyset man with grease-stained hands from constant work in the engineering sections, shook his head. "The station can take some punishment, but we are not a warship. If they focus fire on critical systems, we could lose power, life support, or structural integrity. I can reroute systems and implement damage control protocols, but there are limits to what I can do with duct tape and determination. Brooks listened to each assessment, his mind processing possibilities and probabilities. The strategic situation was clear and unforgiving. They were outgunned, outnumbered, and isolated with no reasonable hope of military victory. But surrender was not an option, both because the Kreth had shown no inclination to accept it in their previous conquests, and because abandoning this position would leave a gap in humanity's defensive perimeter that could be exploited. "We are not going to roll over," Brooks said finally, his voice carrying the authority that had earned him command. "Our mission is to defend this station and buy time for Earth to respond. Every minute we hold out is another minute for our people to prepare. We fight smart, we use every advantage we have, and we make them pay for every meter they take." "Understood." The assembled officers nodded, their expressions grim but resolved. They were professionals who had known the risks when they accepted their positions, and they would face what came with the courage and determination that defined humanity's best qualities. The meeting concluded with final preparations, and a silent acknowledgement that many of them might not survive what was coming. When the Kreth fleet emerged from FTL travel, they did so with the precision of a military force that had conducted similar operations countless times before. 47 ships materialized in a coordinated pattern that immediately established firing solutions and defensive positions. The lead vessel, a massive dreadnought that dwarfed even the largest human ships, broadcast a message in the trade language that both species had established during their initial contacts. "Human outpost, you occupy territory that the Kreth Collective has claimed. Your presence here is an affront to our sovereignty and a threat to our security interests. You will power down all weapon systems, surrender control of your station, and prepare to be boarded. Resistance will be met with immediate destruction." Brooks stood in the command center, listening to the ultimatum with a mixture of anger and cold calculation. The Kreth were testing humanity, probing for weakness and attempting to establish dominance through intimidation. But the territorial claim was spurious at best. Meridian had been established in neutral space, far from any Kreth colonies or outposts, and international law recognized the principle of first establishment when claims overlapped. He opened a communication channel, his voice broadcast to both the Kreth fleet and recorded for transmission to Earth. "This is Captain Henry Brooks, commanding officer of Outpost Meridian. Your territorial claim has no basis in established law or prior occupation. This station was built in neutral space with full recognition of all neighboring powers. We will not surrender, and we will defend our position. I strongly advise you to withdraw before this situation escalates beyond diplomatic resolution." The response came almost immediately, delivered with the arrogance of a species accustomed to getting its way through force. "Your refusal is noted and irrelevant. You have 30 of your minutes to comply. After that time, we will take the station by force and eliminate all resistance. This is your final opportunity to avoid unnecessary death." Brooks cut the channel and turned to his command staff. "They expect us to fold because we are outnumbered. They think humanity will back down when confronted with superior force. Let us show them exactly how wrong they are. All stations, prepare for combat. Target their lead ship first, then prioritize any vessel that breaks formation to close with us. Fight smart and make every shot count." The 30 minutes crawled past with agonizing slowness. Every crew member on Meridian knew what was coming, and they used the time to make peace with themselves in whatever way they could. Some wrote messages to loved ones back on Earth. Others checked and rechecked their equipment with the nervous energy of people who needed something to do with their hands. A few gathered in small groups, sharing quiet conversations or simply being present with the people who had become their extended family in this remote outpost. When the deadline expired, the Kreth did not waste time with further communication. The dreadnought's main weapons array lit up with the distinctive blue glow of charged particle cannons, and beams of coherent energy lanced across the void toward Meridian. Carter's defensive teams responded with remarkable speed. Point defense systems, tracking and intercepting what they could while the station's shields absorbed the initial impacts with flares of dissipating energy. The battle began in earnest, a desperate fight between determination and overwhelming odds. Meridian's missile batteries launched salvos toward the approaching fleet, each warhead guided by sophisticated targeting systems that adjusted for enemy countermeasures. Several Kreth destroyers took hits, their shields flaring bright before failing under repeated impacts. One destroyer actually broke apart, its hull torn open by a direct hit to its power core that sent debris spinning away into the darkness. But for every small victory, the Kreth responded with devastating firepower. Energy beams carved through Meridian's shields, overloading generators and forcing Cole's engineering teams to implement emergency power reroutes. Kinetic projectiles slammed into the station's hull with impacts that sent shockwaves through the structure, fracturing armor plating and causing pressure drops in outer compartments. Damage control teams rushed from crisis to crisis, sealing breaches and fighting fires while trying to keep critical systems operational. Brooks watched the tactical displays with growing dread as the situation deteriorated. They were inflicting damage, more than the Kreth had probably expected from an isolated outpost, but it was not enough. The enemy fleet was simply too large, too well armed, and too coordinated. Within 2 hours of combat, Meridian had lost 30% of its defensive capabilities, and casualties were mounting as sections of the station depressurized or lost life support. Dr. Grant worked frantically in the makeshift medical centers, treating burns, explosive decompression injuries, and trauma from flying debris. Her staff moved with practiced efficiency, triaging patients and doing everything possible to save lives with resources that were rapidly depleting. But Grant knew, as everyone knew, that they were fighting a losing battle. The question was not whether they would fall, but how long they could hold out and whether their sacrifice would matter. In the command center, Morrison continued tracking the battle and feeding tactical data to the weapons teams, her voice calm despite the chaos erupting around them. "We have lost contact with sections 7 through 12, she reported. Hull breaches on multiple decks, shield strength down to 18% and falling. Weapons systems are operating at 40% efficiency. Brooks made a decision that had been weighing on him since the battle began. Prepare to evacuate non-essential personnel to the emergency pods, he ordered. If the station becomes untenable, I want our people to have a chance. Set the pods for automated deployment toward the nearest human colony. It is a long shot, but better than nothing. Before Morrison could implement the order, the sensor array detected something that made her pause. Captain, we have multiple new contacts entering the system. They are not Kreth signatures. The energy readings are consistent with human FTL drives, but the scale is enormous. I am reading hundreds of ships. Brooks felt a surge of hope mixed with disbelief. Put it on the main display, he commanded. The holographic projection updated, showing a massive fleet emerging from faster-than-light travel at the edge of the system. But these were not reinforcements from the colonies, or a defensive force scraped together from nearby military installations. This was Earth's full military might, deployed with a speed and coordination that suggested they had been preparing for this exact scenario. The fleet that materialized included 300 warships, ranging from nimble corvettes to massive dreadnoughts that matched the Kreth vessels in size and exceeded them in weapons capability. But more importantly, the fleet included vessels that humanity had kept hidden during all diplomatic contacts with the Kreth. These were the products of secret military development programs that had consumed enormous resources and represented humanity's insurance policy against exactly this kind of aggression. The lead human vessel broadcast a message that was simultaneously transmitted to Meridian and the Kreth fleet. This is Admiral Patricia Hughes, commanding the United Earth Defense Fleet. The attack on Outpost Meridian is an act of war against humanity. You are ordered to cease all hostile actions immediately, withdraw from this system, and prepare for diplomatic negotiations to resolve this conflict. Any continued aggression will be met with overwhelming force. The Kreth commander, either through arrogance or miscalculation, chose to escalate rather than retreat. Several destroyers broke formation and accelerated toward the human fleet, their weapons charging for engagement. It was a fatal mistake that revealed how little the Kreth actually understood about the species they had chosen to attack. The human response was precise and devastating. Advanced targeting systems locked onto the approaching Kreth ships, and weapons that had never been seen in combat unleashed hell across the void. Directed energy weapons with focusing arrays that concentrated power to unprecedented levels sliced through Kreth shields like they were tissue paper. Railguns firing projectiles at relativistic velocities punched through armor plating and detonated with kinetic force that tore ships apart from the inside. And most terrifyingly, humanity deployed antimatter warheads that had been theoretical weapons until this moment. The destroyers that had broken formation simply ceased to exist, transformed into expanding clouds of plasma and debris in the span of seconds. The remaining Kreth fleet found themselves facing an enemy that was not only their equal in numbers but vastly superior in weapons technology and tactical coordination. The battle that followed was brutally one-sided, humanity's forces systematically dismantling the Kreth attack fleet with a combination of overwhelming firepower and strategic brilliance. Brooks and his crew watched in stunned silence as the fleet they had been desperately fighting was methodically destroyed. Within 30 minutes, every Kreth vessel in the system had been either obliterated or damaged to the point of being combat ineffective. The few ships that attempted to flee found their FTL drives disabled by electromagnetic pulse weapons that humanity had developed specifically to prevent enemy retreat. Admiral Hughes contacted Meridian directly, her voice carrying both relief and grim determination. "Captain Brooks, status report on your station and personnel." Brooks struggled to find his voice, the adrenaline and stress of the past hours catching up with him. "We have sustained heavy damage and casualties, Admiral, but we held the line. We kept fighting until you arrived. You did more than that, Captain. You bought us the time we needed and showed the Kreth that humanity does not break easily. Medical ships and engineering teams are en route to assist with repairs and casualties. But I need you to understand what happens next. The attack on your outpost was not just an isolated incident. It was a deliberate provocation, and Earth's response will be proportional to the threat." What followed over the next days would become one of the most controversial decisions in human history, debated by philosophers, politicians, and military strategists for generations. The United Earth Government, in consultation with the military command and civilian leadership, made a choice that would forever alter humanity's relationship with other spacefaring civilizations. They decided to make an example that would resonate across the galaxy. Intelligence gathered from captured Kreth databases and interrogation of survivors revealed the location of the Kreth Homeworld, a planet called Vrakthys that sat at the heart of their empire. It was a world of 4 billion inhabitants, the cultural and political center of their civilization, protected by defense platforms and orbital fortifications that the Kreth believed made it impregnable. Humanity's response was calculated to send an unmistakable message to the Kreth and any other species that might be watching. They would demonstrate that attacking human installations would result in consequences so severe that no rational actor would risk it. The debate within Earth's leadership was intense and divisive, with many arguing that such an extreme response would make humanity appear barbaric and justify future aggression as defensive measures. But the decision was ultimately made by those who understood the realities of interstellar politics. Humanity was still a relatively new player in galactic affairs, and perceptions of strength or weakness would shape every future interaction. The Kreth had attacked believing humanity would be easy prey, and if that perception was not corrected decisively, others would follow. The operation was designated Broken Spear, a reference to the ancient concept of breaking an enemy's will to fight by destroying their ability to wage war. A strike fleet consisting of 75 ships departed from Earth with a specific and terrifying mission. They carried weapons that humanity had hoped never to use, devices that represented the absolute pinnacle of destructive capability. Among the fleet was Commander Gregory Banks, a weapons specialist who had spent his entire career studying the theoretical applications of relativistic weapons and planetary-scale destruction. At 35, he was one of the youngest officers to command a dreadnought, his rapid promotion driven by expertise in systems that most hoped would remain theoretical. He stood on the bridge of his ship, the Retribution, as they approached the Kreth home system. The Kreth detected the approaching human fleet long before they arrived, their sensor networks tracking the unprecedented movement of military assets toward their core territory. Emergency broadcasts went out across Kreth space, calling for any available ships to defend the homeworld. But the Kreth military was scattered across dozens of occupied systems, enforcing their empire through presence and intimidation. Gathering a defensive force large enough to contest humanity's strike fleet would take days, perhaps weeks. Admiral Hughes, commanding the operation from her flagship, sent a final communication to the Kreth government before the attack commenced. It was broadcast across all frequencies, recorded for posterity, and designed to make humanity's position absolutely clear. To the leadership and people of the Kreth Collective, your military forces attacked a peaceful human outpost without provocation or legitimate cause. Your actions resulted in the deaths of innocent people and constituted an act of war against all humanity. We offered peaceful coexistence and received aggression in response. Therefore, we are implementing a response that will ensure such aggression is never repeated. What follows is not revenge, but a calculated demonstration of the consequences that await any civilization that chooses to prey upon humanity. We gave you every opportunity to choose a different path. You chose violence. Now you will understand the full measure of humanity's capacity for war. The Kreth homeworld's defenses activated immediately, orbital platforms and ground-based installations, targeting the approaching human fleet with every weapon at their disposal. Energy beams and missiles filled the space around Vrakthais, a desperate attempt to drive back an enemy that had come with a singular purpose. But humanity's ships were equipped with shields and countermeasures that had been developed specifically for this kind of assault, and they pushed through the defensive fire with minimal losses. Commander Banks activated the weapons systems on Retribution, his hands steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to do. The ship's main weapon was something that had existed only in theoretical papers until 6 months ago, when Earth's most brilliant scientists had been given unlimited resources to develop planet-killing capabilities. It was called a stellar compression warhead, a device that would create a localized gravitational anomaly capable of destabilizing a planet's core. Firing solution locked, Banks reported to Admiral Hughes. Target is the planet's northern hemisphere. Estimated cascading effects will destabilize the entire planetary structure within 6 hours of detonation, projecting total planetary failure within 12 to 18 hours. Hughes gave the order that would change history. Fire. The warhead launched, a single missile that accelerated to near light speed before impacting Vrakthais' atmosphere. The detonation was unlike anything witnessed in conventional warfare, a burst of energy that punched through the planet's crust and initiated a reaction in the molten core. What followed was a slow-motion catastrophe that played out over hours, visible to every sensor and observatory in the region. The Kreth homeworld began to tear itself apart from the inside. Massive earthquakes rippled across continents, cities crumbling as the ground beneath them buckled and fractured. Volcanic eruptions on a scale never before seen sent plumes of ash and magma into the atmosphere, blotting out the sun and raining destruction on everything below. The oceans boiled as thermal energy from the destabilizing core superheated the water, creating steam explosions that devastated coastal regions. Billions of Kreth died in those hours, their civilization's capital reduced to a dying world that would be uninhabitable within days. Evacuation attempts were launched, but the sheer scale of the disaster and the speed at which it unfolded meant that only a fraction of the population could escape. Ships departed loaded beyond capacity, carrying desperate refugees who watched their homeworld die behind them. The human fleet did not interfere with the evacuation efforts, allowing Kreth vessels to flee the system unmolested. This was not mercy in the traditional sense, but a calculated decision to ensure that survivors would spread the word of what had happened. The message needed witnesses, people who could tell other civilizations exactly what humanity was capable of when pushed to war. Back on Meridian, Brooks watched the reports coming in from the Kreth system with a mixture of emotions he could not fully process. The outpost had been repaired enough to be functional, though scars from the battle remained visible throughout the station. Casualties had been severe, 47 dead, and over 100 wounded, names and faces he would remember for the rest of his life. Morrison entered his ready room without knocking, something she only did when matters were urgent or deeply personal. Captain, the latest intelligence reports are in. The Kreth Collective has formally requested a ceasefire and diplomatic negotiations. Their remaining leadership is in disarray, and several subject species under their control are using the chaos to launch independence movements. The Empire is collapsing. Brooks nodded slowly, his eyes distant. And the reaction from other civilizations, what are we hearing from the wider galaxy? Mixed, Morrison admitted. Some species are horrified by what we did and have condemned it as genocidal excess. Others are reaching out with diplomatic overtures, suddenly very interested in establishing formal relations with humanity. And a few, the ones who have been victims of Kreth aggression in the past, have expressed private gratitude that someone finally made them pay. The cost, Brooks said quietly. What did we just become? Morrison sat across from him, her expression troubled but resolute. We became what we needed to be to survive. The Kreth saw us as weak because we valued peace and tried to avoid conflict. They thought they could push us around and take what they wanted without consequences. We showed them, and everyone else watching, that humanity will defend itself with everything we have. Brooks stood and walked to the window, looking out at the stars that seemed so much less innocent now. The people we lost here, the civilians on that planet, the future we just changed by showing the galaxy our capacity for destruction. It all weighs on me. I wonder if we could have found another way. Maybe, Morrison replied. But the Kreth made their choice when they attacked. They gambled that we would not respond with overwhelming force, and they lost. If we had done anything less, other species would see it as weakness and test our limits. The galaxy is not a place where pacifism keeps you safe. Sometimes the willingness to be ruthless is what prevents future conflict. The weeks following the destruction of Vrakthi's brought significant changes to humanity's position in galactic politics. The United Earth government found itself navigating a complex web of reactions ranging from outright condemnation to cautious respect. Diplomatic channels that had been slow to open suddenly became active, with dozens of civilizations seeking to establish formal relationships with this species that had demonstrated such devastating military capability. The Kreth Collective, once a dominant military power, fragmented into competing factions as their remaining territories descended into civil war. Species that had been subjugated for generations seized the opportunity to break free, and the political map of that sector of space underwent rapid transformation. Some human leaders advocated for intervention to prevent humanitarian disasters in the collapsing empire, while others argued that humanity should focus on consolidating its own position and avoid being drawn into conflicts that predated their arrival on the galactic stage. Admiral Hughes became one of the most controversial figures in human history overnight, praised by some as the decisive leader who protected humanity's future, and condemned by others as a war criminal who authorized genocide. She accepted both the accolades and the criticism with the same stoic professionalism that had defined her career, understanding that history would debate the morality of her decisions long after she was gone. In a statement to the United Earth Assembly, she addressed the criticism directly and without apology. The Kreth Collective attacked our people without provocation, believing we would be easy victims. Our response was designed to ensure that such a miscalculation would never happen again, War is not a philosophical exercise conducted from the safety of committee rooms. It is a brutal reality where survival depends on the willingness to do what is necessary. I ordered the strike on Vrakthais knowing full well the cost in lives and the burden it would place on my conscience. I would make the same decision again if faced with identical circumstances, because my primary duty is to the survival and security of humanity. The debate raged across Earth and the colonies, in government chambers and public forums, in academic institutions and military academies. Philosophers argued about proportionality and the ethics of collective punishment. Military strategists analyzed the operation from every angle, examining whether alternatives could have achieved the same strategic objectives with less loss of life. Religious leaders across dozens of faiths struggled to reconcile the action with their moral frameworks, some condemning it as an unforgivable sin, while others defended it as necessary justice. But regardless of the moral debates, the practical effect was undeniable. No civilization that had witnessed the destruction of Vrakthais would casually consider attacking human interests. The willingness to escalate to absolute measures, to treat threats to humanity's survival with overwhelming and disproportionate force, became the cornerstone of Earth's strategic doctrine. It was a position that isolated humanity in some diplomatic circles while earning grudging respect in others. Brooks received a promotion and a medal for his defense of Meridian, honors that he accepted with mixed feelings. The ceremony was held on Earth, in a grand hall filled with dignitaries and military brass, but his mind kept returning to the names of the people he had lost. 47 crew members who would never return home, who had trusted him to keep them safe, and paid the ultimate price for humanity's emergence as a galactic power. After the ceremony, he sought out Dr. Grant, who had also been decorated for her efforts to save lives during the battle. They stood together on a balcony overlooking the city, watching humanity go about its daily business in blissful ignorance of how close they had come to a war of extinction. "Do you think it was worth it?" Grant asked quietly. "All those deaths, ours and theirs, for this peace we have now?" Brooks considered the question carefully before responding. "I do not know if worth is the right concept. War is not a transaction where you weigh costs against benefits and make a rational choice. It is chaos and tragedy and choices made under impossible pressure. The Kreth forced our hand when they attacked. What happened after was a consequence of that initial decision. But I can tell you this. Every civilization out there now knows that humanity will not be pushed around. Our people can expand, explore, and build without fear that we will be seen as easy prey. That has value, even if the price was higher than any of us wanted to pay." Grant nodded slowly. "I saved every life I could during that battle. I will carry the ones I could not save with me forever. But I also understand that their sacrifice bought something real. Safety for everyone who comes after. I just hope we use that safety wisely and do not let ourselves become the monsters we fought against." Years would pass before the full implications of those events became clear. Humanity expanded its territory with confidence, establishing new colonies and defensive positions that other civilizations respected. Trade agreements and diplomatic alliances were negotiated from a position of strength, rather than the tentative uncertainty that had characterized early human efforts at galactic diplomacy. The United Earth government invested heavily in military development, ensuring that the capabilities demonstrated at Vrakthais remained a credible deterrent. But there were also those who worked to ensure that humanity's reputation was not solely defined by that singular act of destruction. Humanitarian missions were launched to assist the refugee populations displaced by the Kreth Collective's collapse. Cultural exchange programs were established with dozens of species, building bridges of understanding that went beyond military deterrence. Scientists collaborated on research projects that advanced knowledge across multiple civilizations, demonstrating that humanity could be a force for progress and cooperation as well as war. The outpost that had started it all, Meridian, was rebuilt and expanded into a major defensive installation and diplomatic hub. New personnel rotated through, carrying on the mission while honoring the memory of those who had held the line when it mattered most. A memorial was constructed in the central hub, a simple wall listing the names of the fallen and bearing an inscription that captured both the tragedy and necessity of what had occurred. The inscription read simply, "They attacked because they believed we were weak. We responded because survival demanded strength. We remember the cost because forgetting would dishonor the sacrifice. May those who come after build a peace worthy of the price paid here." Brooks eventually returned to Meridian as its permanent commander, choosing to remain at the outpost rather than accept positions on Earth or in the core colonies. He walked past that memorial every day, reading the names and remembering faces, voices, and moments from the battle that had defined his life. He supervised the training of new personnel, ensuring they understood not just the tactical lessons, but the moral weight of the decisions they might one day face. Morrison stayed with him, promoted to executive officer, and eventually becoming his second in command in more than just title. They worked together to build Meridian into something more than just a military base, a symbol of humanity's commitment to defending its people and its refusal to be intimidated by superior force. The station became a destination for diplomats and military leaders from other civilizations, all curious to see the place where humanity had drawn its line in the sand. In the years that followed, other conflicts arose and were resolved through a combination of diplomacy and the implicit threat of what humanity had proven capable of doing. The destruction of Vrakthi's was never repeated, becoming instead a precedent that shaped behavior without needing to be invoked directly. Other civilizations understood that humanity would escalate to any level necessary to protect its interests, and that understanding prevented the kind of miscalculation that had led to the Kreth attack. The moral debate continued, generation after generation, examining the events through different philosophical and ethical frameworks. Some scholars argued that humanity's response had been monstrous and set a terrible precedent for interstellar relations. Others contended that it was a necessary and proportional response to an existential threat, that allowing the attack to go unpunished would have invited further aggression that could have ended with humanity's extinction. What was undeniable was that humanity had emerged from its first major interstellar conflict with its survival secured, and its position in galactic politics fundamentally altered. They were no longer the uncertain newcomers seeking acceptance from established powers. They were a force to be respected and, if necessary, feared. The price of that transformation had been measured in billions of lives, and the moral burden carried by everyone who had participated in or authorized the response. Brooks spent his final years at Meridian, retiring eventually but never truly leaving the station that had become his home. He watched new generations take over the responsibilities he had carried, young officers who had studied the battle in their academies, and now walked the corridors where it had actually happened. He answered their questions when they asked, sharing the reality of decisions made under fire and the weight of consequences that could never be undone. In his final recorded interview, conducted by a historian documenting the era, Brooks reflected on the events that had defined his life and humanity's place in the galaxy. "We were faced with a choice when the Kreth attacked," he said, his voice carrying the weight of decades spent living with the consequences. "We could have responded with moderation, accepted significant losses, and hoped that showing restraint would earn us respect. Or we could demonstrate that attacking humanity would result in consequences so severe that no rational actor would risk it. The leadership made their choice and I executed their orders. Whether it was right or wrong, I do not presume to say. I only know that it worked. Humanity survived and grew stronger. The people I lost at Meridian did not die for nothing. Their sacrifice bought us the safety we enjoy now." Was there another way, the historian asked, echoing the question that had defined the debate for decades. Brooks was silent for a long moment before responding. "Maybe. Probably. History is full of moments where different choices could have led to different outcomes. But we do not get to make decisions with the benefit of hindsight. We make them with imperfect information under pressure, with lives hanging in the balance. The Kreth chose violence. We responded in kind, but with a scale and finality that ensured the lesson would not need to be taught again. I have spent every day since wondering if we could have done better, but I have also seen the peace that response brought us, and I cannot say it was worthless. The legacy of those events continued to shape humanity's path through the galaxy for generations. The United Earth government maintained its military capabilities while also investing in diplomatic and cultural initiatives designed to demonstrate that humanity could be more than just a military power. The balance was delicate, requiring constant attention and adjustment as new challenges emerged and old wounds slowly healed. The Kreth survivors, scattered across multiple refugee settlements and newly independent worlds, carried their own complicated relationship with what had happened. Some harbored deep resentment and dreams of eventual revenge. Others acknowledged that their leadership had made catastrophic errors in judgment and worked toward building new societies that learned from those mistakes. A few even established cautious relationships with human communities, finding common ground in shared experiences of loss and the desire to prevent future conflicts. The monument at Meridian became a pilgrimage site for people throughout human space and beyond. Visitors came to pay respects to the fallen, to reflect on the events that had occurred there, and to contemplate the questions of war, peace, and the responsibilities that came with power. The station itself evolved into something more than its military function, becoming a center for peace studies and conflict resolution where representatives from dozens of civilizations worked to develop frameworks for preventing the kind of escalation that had led to Vrakthi's. In the end, the attack on Meridian and humanity's response would be remembered as a turning point in galactic history, not because it was the largest battle or the most strategically significant conflict, but because it established principles that would govern interstellar relations for centuries. The principle that aggression against civilian installations would meet overwhelming retaliation. The principle that humanity would defend its people with every resource available. And perhaps most importantly, the principle that military might must be tempered with responsibility and the constant effort to find alternatives to violence. The story of Outpost Meridian became legend, told and retold in different forms by different species. To humanity, it was a tale of courage under fire and the price of survival. To the Kreth survivors, it was a cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimating others and the consequences of aggressive imperialism. To other civilizations, it was a lesson about the importance of understanding potential adversaries before committing to conflict. And in the quiet moments, when those who had lived through the events gathered to remember, they spoke not of glory or victory, but of the people they had lost and the burden they carried. They talked about the friends who had died defending the station, the billions who had perished on Vrakthi's, and the weight of knowing that their actions had changed the course of history. They debated whether they had made the right choices, whether alternatives existed that they had failed to see, and what responsibilities they owed to future generations. The universe was vast and unforgiving, filled with species pursuing their own interests with varying degrees of morality and restraint. Humanity had learned, in the hardest way possible, that survival in such an environment required both the capacity for devastating violence and the wisdom to use it only when absolutely necessary. The challenge for every generation that followed would be maintaining that balance, remembering the lessons of Meridian without becoming the kind of civilization that used force as a first resort rather than a last one. Brooks died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, still at Meridian, surrounded by the legacy of his service and the memorial to those who had fallen under his command. His funeral was attended by dignitaries from dozens of worlds, military officers who had served with or learned from him, and civilians whose lives had been protected by the choices he had made. They spoke of his courage, his dedication, and the impossible burden he had carried with quiet dignity. But perhaps the most fitting tribute came from Morrison, who had stood beside him through the battle and the years that followed. She spoke at his memorial service, her voice steady despite the emotion underlying her words. Captain Brooks understood something that many people never grasp, That doing the right thing is not always clear or simple. That sometimes all our choices are terrible, and we have to make the least terrible one and then live with the consequences. He made those hard choices when it mattered, and he never pretended they were easy or that he had no doubts. He was human in the best sense of that word. Flawed, uncertain, but willing to do what was necessary even when the cost was more than he wanted to pay. The galaxy moved on, as it always did, with new crises and challenges emerging to test humanity and the other civilizations sharing the stars. But the lessons of Meridian endured, a reminder that peace was not a passive state, but something that had to be actively defended and carefully maintained. That strength without restraint led to tyranny, but restraint without strength invited aggression. That the highest form of wisdom was knowing when to fight and when to seek alternatives, and having the courage to act accordingly. And so the story ended where it began, with a small outpost at the edge of human space standing watch over the darkness beyond. New crews took their positions, aware of the history they inherited and the responsibilities that came with it. They monitored sensors, maintained weapon systems, and trained for scenarios they hoped would never occur. But they also engaged in diplomacy, hosted cultural exchanges, and worked to build the relationships that might prevent future conflicts from escalating to the point where force became necessary. The memorial remained, names etched in permanent tribute to those who had given everything. And beside it, a new inscription was added, commissioned by the United Earth government and approved by representatives from a dozen other civilizations. It read, "In memory of all who fell at Meridian and Vrakthais. May their sacrifice teach us the true cost of war and the precious value of peace. May we have the strength to defend what matters and the wisdom to seek understanding before we seek victory. May we never forget that every choice has consequences that echo across generations." The stars continued their eternal dance, indifferent to the struggles of the creatures who navigated the spaces between them. But among those creatures, humanity had carved out its place with determination, sacrifice, and a willingness to do whatever was necessary to survive. They had shown the galaxy their capacity for both terrible violence and remarkable compassion, for devastating warfare and earnest diplomacy. They had become neither saints nor monsters, but something more complex and human. And in the end, perhaps that was the real lesson of Meridian. Not that humanity was uniquely virtuous or exceptionally ruthless, but that they were capable of both and had the responsibility to choose wisely between them. The attack on the outpost had forced that choice in the most dramatic way possible, and the response had defined humanity's character for generations. Whether that definition was ultimately positive or negative would be determined by how future generations used the security that sacrifice had purchased. The universe offered no guarantees, no promises that good intentions would lead to good outcomes or that sacrifices would prove worthwhile. It offered only the harsh reality of competition for resources and survival among species with different values and incompatible goals. In that environment, humanity had demonstrated that they would not be easy prey, that attacking human interests would result in consequences severe enough to make others think twice. But they had also shown, in the years that followed, that strength could be used to create rather than destroy. That power could protect the vulnerable rather than exploit them. That the species capable of erasing a homeworld from existence could also work to heal the wounds of war and build bridges between different cultures and civilizations. It was a balance that required constant vigilance and regular recalibration. Easy to tip too far toward militarism and become the monsters they had fought against. Easy to lean too far toward pacifism and invite the kind of aggression that had started the conflict in the first place. The path humanity chose to walk was narrow and treacherous, lined with moral hazards and ethical dilemmas that admitted no simple solutions. But walk it they did, generation after generation, carrying the lessons of Meridian forward into an uncertain future. They remembered the attack, the battle, and the response. They honored the dead and contemplated the living. They debated the decisions made and imagined alternatives that might have been. And through it all, they maintained the watch, standing ready to defend what they had built while working to ensure that such defense would never again require the terrible measures employed at Vrachthi's. The story of how humanity responded when their outpost was attacked became more than history. It became mythology, shaped and reshaped by each generation to reflect their own values and concerns. Some told it as a tale of justified retribution, others as a cautionary warning about the dangers of excessive force. The truth, as always, was more complicated than any single narrative could capture. What remained constant across all retellings was the recognition that choices made in moments of crisis could reshape entire civilizations, that the men and women who held positions of authority during such moments bore terrible responsibilities that would haunt them regardless of the outcomes, and that the price of security and peace was often paid in currencies that could never be repaid or forgotten. So the watch continued at Meridian and thousands of other outposts scattered across human space. Personnel rotated through, carrying on missions they might never fully understand the importance of until crisis arrived. They maintained equipment, ran drills, and hoped that their vigilance would prevent the kind of miscalculation that had led to catastrophe. They were the inheritors of a legacy purchased with sacrifice, and they bore that legacy with varying degrees of awareness and responsibility. And somewhere in the vastness of space, on worlds both familiar and alien, people remembered. They remembered the outpost that stood when it would have been easier to surrender. They remembered the response that ensured such attacks would not be repeated. They remembered the billions who died on Vrachthi's and the questions about morality and necessity that their deaths provoked. They remembered because forgetting would diminish the sacrifice and dishonor the memory of everyone who had been caught up in events larger than themselves. The legacy of those events would echo forward through time, influencing decisions and shaping attitudes in ways both obvious and subtle. Future conflicts would be evaluated through the lens of what happened at Meridian, with leaders on all sides asking whether they wanted to risk triggering the kind of response that had devastated the Kreth Collective. That deterrent effect, purchased at such terrible cost, became one of the foundational pillars of interstellar stability in the region. But stability was not stagnation, and the galaxy continued to evolve in ways that created new challenges and opportunities. Humanity expanded its influence through a combination of military strength, economic development, and cultural exchange. They built alliances with some civilizations while maintaining cautious distances from others. They intervened in conflicts when their interests were threatened and stayed neutral, when involvement would have created more problems than it solved. Through it all, the memory of Meridian served as both inspiration and warning. Inspiration for those who needed to find courage in the face of overwhelming odds, warning for those tempted to use force without fully considering the consequences. The attack and response had revealed fundamental truths about humanity's character, capabilities, and values. They had shown what humans were capable of when pushed to extremes, for better and worse. And in the final analysis, perhaps that was the most important outcome. Not the specific tactical or strategic results, but the self-knowledge that came from being tested at the fundamental level of survival. Humanity learned what it was willing to do to protect its people and its future. They learned the weight of such decisions and the impossibility of making them without moral cost. They learned that righteousness was rarely clear, and that even necessary actions could haunt those who carried them out. The outpost at Meridian stood as a permanent reminder of these lessons, a monument not just to those who had fallen, but to the complexity of existence in a universe where survival and morality sometimes conflicted in ways that admitted no easy resolution. And as new generations took their posts and maintained the watch, they inherited not just the equipment and protocols, but the burden of understanding what their predecessors had faced, and what they themselves might one day be called upon to do. The story had no neat ending because life continued beyond the dramatic moments that defined historical narratives. People lived with the consequences, adapted to new realities, and made choices that would shape the stories told by future generations. The attack on the outpost and the erasure of a homeworld in response became part of the ongoing story of humanity's journey through the cosmos, significant chapters, but not the final word. What the future would bring remained unknown, as it always did. New threats would emerge, new opportunities would present themselves, and new choices would need to be made. But the men and women who faced those challenges would do so with the knowledge of what had come before, the understanding of what humanity was capable of accomplishing, and what price such accomplishments might demand. They would carry forward the legacy of Meridian, that small outpost that had become the fulcrum on which galactic history turned. And somewhere, in the vastness of space where Vrakthys had once orbited its star, debris continued its eternal dance through the void. A reminder to all who pass through that system of the consequences of miscalculation, the cost of aggression, and the terrible power that civilizations could wield when pushed beyond the limits of their restraint. It was a graveyard and a warning, a monument to billions of lives, and a deterrent to those who might consider following the path that had led to such destruction. The universe was vast and cold and indifferent to the struggles of those who inhabited it. But within that vastness, humanity had claimed its place with determination and sacrifice. They had shown that they could endure terrible tests and emerge stronger, that they could defend what mattered while still striving to be better than their worst moments. They had learned that survival required both strength and wisdom, that power without restraint led to tyranny while restraint without power invited destruction. It was a lesson written in fire and loss, purchased with lives that could never be returned and choices that could never be unmade. But it was a lesson that would endure, passed down through generations, as humanity continued its journey among the stars. And at the heart of that lesson was a simple truth that Captain Henry Brooks and his crew had demonstrated with their actions at Meridian. When tested at the fundamental level of survival, humanity would stand and fight with everything they had. They would pay any price necessary to protect their people and their future, and they would carry the weight of that determination, along with all its moral complexity, as they built the civilization that their sacrifice had secured.